Hey guys, thank you for joining us for another Men's Bible Brief. This is Pastor Autry. If you can, join us on Wednesday mornings. The info is on the screen. If not, we got you covered right here on YouTube. Well, let's go ahead and join the brief in progress. God bless you. Well, what's up, fellas? Thank you for joining us for our Men's Bible Brief. And today, as we always do on First Wednesdays, it's just a straight open mic. And I think it's appropriate for the July 4th weekend. And I hope you had a wonderful celebration as we've been able to celebrate the freedoms that we have in this country. And so we're going to go ahead and jump into our session for today. Boy, we really had a great one. And so, wish you could make those Wednesdays. But again, you can chop it up on the rewind, which is the graphic on the screen. You may want to jump in on this one because, boy, we really had some good conversations, and we're probably going to have to do a series just on Christians and politics because those are the type of questions that actually came up. And so thank you for joining us, and we're going to jump in today. Our hump day food for thought is this: wisdom is seeing life through the eyes of God and living life in the will of God. And so that's a great one right there. And so hopefully that'll give you some encouragement in your tank as we go forward today. We have 7 questions today that I'm going to raise, and I'm going to go into a lot of detail. Again, that's for the talkback session, the rewind session on Saturday mornings. And so if you can catch that, make sure you check that out. But got 7 questions for you. And here's the first one. And it's really a 2-part question. What is the balance between allegiance to the flag and the cross? And are Christians today more devoted to the flag than the cross? I think that's a great question. There is an expectation in Scripture that we ought to respect the state, the government. I think if you chase this historically for the church, since the completion of the New Testament, even till today, the church has held the position that we have a responsibility to respect, maybe even honor the state, but our allegiance should be primarily to the cross. That should be our absolute allegiance. And so I put a lot of footnotes here. Yes, we are to respect government. Yes, we're not to seek to overthrow the government. We surely expect the government to do what it's required to do. God ordains governments in Scripture for the purpose of protecting the citizenship and creating an environment where people can flourish. And so surely that is the fundamental reason why God ordains government. But we're not to obey the government blindly. We are called from time to time to speak truth to power. Here you can insert the prophets. You can even insert Jesus, who comes with a prophetic ministry. And surely he spoke to the ills of those who were in charge, those institutions, in that manner. We surely see that with Frederick Douglass, who was a preacher and a Christian. And if you haven't had a chance to check it out, please do. His speech on what is the 4th of July to the Negro or to the slave, you want to check that out. And as a Christian, he's speaking to the issue of slavery, and he gives a scathing critique on Christianity as practiced during his time, as well as the nation. And sadly, that speech is actually banned in the state of Texas in terms of our educational institutions. I would also throw in here Martin King and many others. They saw themselves as prophets, challenging institutions to do what they were ordained to do. And there's a sense that they all believed in this final judgment that would come and judge all nations for where they fell short of what God expected of them. And so that's kind of where we ought to land. It doesn't mean we have to tear down the country or revolution, but it does mean we ought to respect it as we are in terms of our faith. But at the same time, we surely can speak truth to power. And to quote the words of Martin King, we're not the master or the servant of the state, but no, we're the conscience of the state. I think that's the position that we ought to take as we live in these United States. And so that's question number 1. Question number 2, why do Christians feel they have to fix instead of help others? And yes, there is this kind of self-righteous ethic in Christianity today that if you don't stand with my tribe, if you don't stand with my answers, somehow you are outside the faith. And I just don't believe that Jesus called us to be morality police. I don't believe Jesus called us to be right answer Christians, as if you have the correct ideas in theology, and surely doctrine and theology are important. But if that's the totality of my faith expression, whether I correct people that are in error, I have missed the point of the gospel. We are called to love one another. And part of loving others, I should say, is a gospel responsibility of every single Christian. And so, yes, we want to see people come to faith. Yes, we want to see people convert to the Christian faith. But also, too, we're to be light in darkness. We're to be the salt of the earth. We ought to bring good to this world. That's kind of what Jeremiah was trying to intimate when the exiles were in Babylon. Look, you guys are not going anywhere. You got to seek the good of the nation, even if it's a nation that is against you. And so even in the prophetic announcements of those historical figures I just mentioned, I would argue that what they were after is they wanted a better America, and that's what they ought to do. And so also, too, we shouldn't seek to try to fix people. We should help people. We should love people. And I truly believe the challenge of today is that Christians must learn to love people rather than share the right answers about our faith. And that's a greater challenge. It's easy to share my answers about Christianity. It's something quite differently to love people. And I don't believe God calls us to fix people. God's the one that does the fixing. We've got to meet and love people right where they are, trust the Spirit to do his work in terms of what he wants to do in the lives of people. So that's question number 2. Question number 3, how are Christians to respond to all the shootings in our country? And surely we've had quite a few shootings. Unfortunately, that's kind of where we are today. I think there's a love affair not only with the flag, but I would say there's a love affair with guns, as if somehow that's a biblical or a Christian right. And I definitely believe there's a misunderstanding there. It doesn't mean you don't have the right to protect yourself. I get that. But Christianity is a faith of peace. Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." We ought to be those who seek reconciliation and peace, and not carry guns in order to thrust our will. And surely we should take the position and give people the freedom if they want to defend themselves. But I just think we're in a gun culture, and gun sales are just going through the roof as this issue is hotly debated. I would say there are 3 things we need to keep in mind here. I think the problem with Christians today, we don't seek to try to understand the other side. We listen to videos or we listen to preaching and teachings that only agree with where we stand. So we kind of develop this, what I call an echo chamber Christianity. And that doesn't help us to deal or to engage those who may see things a little bit differently, whether theologically or even philosophically, if they're not a Christian. But I think there are 3 elements to what Christians ought to do when we disagree on issues such as gun shootings. Number 1, we ought to try to understand their position. So those who advocate for gun ownership, I really empathize with the ones who may live out in the rural spaces in Texas where, one of these wild boars, if they come at you, a 9mm is not going to take them out. You need some heavy artillery, or you may find yourself dead. Or if you encounter a bear, I'm sorry, a 9mm or, one of those smaller guns, that's not going to get it. You need some firepower. So I empathize with those living in those spaces. I empathize with those who want to defend themselves in a violent culture. But at the same time, I think that we can still push for some kind of policy or some kind of social policy that would encourage some kind of greater protections for the citizenship, especially our children. And so it's a very divisive issue. I would say, number 1, you got to understand it. Number 2, and I kind of mentioned it in my explanation, you need to empathize. Try to feel where they are. And I think there's a whole lot less of that going on. We just kind of know their position, but we completely reject it. Why do they take that position? Because I think people with good meaning minds and hearts take positions based on their experience. And so we got to empathize. And then number three, I think we should be able to articulate the other side before we decide whether to critique it or disagree with it. And I think that would lead to a greater sense of understanding and maybe more unified solutions rather than these lines that we're drawing due to political or theological tribalism. And so that's a great question that was asked. Question number 4. Shouldn't we expect greater accountability from pastors and leaders? Boy, what a question. Pastors, leaders, and priests, actually. And boy, this one really stirred up the pot a little bit. And I would say yes. I don't think it's out of bounds for Christians, citizens, employees to expect a greater sense of accountability for those who run the institutions. I think that's a biblical idea. I think that's a natural law idea. I think that's a common sense idea. I think it's needed. I think the problem is sometimes accountability, transparency or accountability has been so hijacked and abused that if people in leadership or in these institutions really make sincere mistakes or they really mess up and want to change, they're still demonized. And that's where I kind of part ways. If we surely should be gracious to the populace, we should be gracious to the members, then surely we ought to be gracious and exercise the same type of compassion to those leaders that may make mistakes and fall. Yes, there's always a group of individuals that are hardened. No matter what you say, they're going to stand by their wrong no matter what. And for those, there should be strict accountability. But I think many times those are the ones that hit the news cycle and we miss the plethora or the multitude of those that actually agreed with the accountability measures and stepped aside, got the counseling, and got the support they needed. And so, yes, I do believe there should be a greater sense of accountability for pastors, leaders, and priests. That doesn't excuse Christians in the congregation, but there should be an expectation just for the sense of trust, not just for the people in the congregation, but also in the community or those of non-faith that may be seeking Christ. There should be a sense of trust there. And so I would agree with that question. Great question. Question number 5, should Christianity be legislated? And I thought this was a great question. And where the questioner was coming from was, is Christianity about legislating the faith with every nation that we may find ourselves a part of? And here's where I just part company with many, many Christians. Some Christians believe that when Jesus came with the gospel, the goal was to legislate into law, into state law, our faith. I strongly push back on that. I disagree with that. I see more we're to be light in darkness. I see more of the Christian community kind of in this kind of wilderness exilic experience where the life we live is an example, it's a demonstration, it's a model, it's a witness to the greatness of God, and it's an opportunity to share the gospel. How we seek the good of others demonstrates how good our God is. How we seek to share our faith and the way we do it without offending, without even condemning others is a way that shows forth the heart of God. And so, yes, I would say I would actually disagree that we should legislate the faith. And there's some who believe that America's a Christian nation. I disagree with that, and they think that's what we should shoot for. I disagree. Also under this rubric was the question, are we called to obey the government? And I would say we're called to honor it. Obey is a little bit strong for me. We ought to respect it, but it comes with footnotes. And surely if the government would ask us to contravene our faith, we can't go with you, and whatever the consequences are, then we are willing to suffer those consequences. And so that's kind of where I stand, and I think that's one of the mistakes. We are not called to legislate the faith. No, we're called to share the faith. We're called to be witnesses of the faith. We're called to demonstrate what the faith is all about. Question number 6, what are your thoughts on the recent Supreme Court ruling on affirmative action? And boy, I have a load of thoughts, can't share everything here, but I will share a few things. Number 1, if there's ever a ruling that I thought misdirects and misses the target, this is one. Because many are under the impression that somehow the greater or the largest group of beneficiaries of affirmative action are African Americans, and nothing can be further from the truth. There are benefits, but even that is misunderstood. Affirmative action is one of many factors that institutions or educational institutions would use in factoring in someone's admission. And even in those cases, it was not because their scores were lower. That was not the dominant case. No, it was under those circumstances that they wouldn't have opportunities to certain institutions. They had the qualifications, and many times they had greater qualifications. But because of their economic background, because of the educational background, they did not have similar or greater qualifications as someone else, but they had the capacity to do it well. Also, too, generally, particularly in the business spaces, it is the white women that actually benefited the most from affirmative action. And I think rightly so, as they have demonstrated that it wasn't that they needed a handout. They just never got a shot at the table. And when given the shot, clearly they belong. They had the outcomes, they had the fruit, that they were never given a fair shot from the beginning. And so this is not a handout, as it's been so politicized as to why this legislation have existed. No, the original legislation, I think even the application in many cases, for the most part, has been, here's a candidate who under any other circumstances would be sitting at the table, but because of where they come from and because of their racial makeup, they don't have an opportunity as anybody else. They're more than qualified to do the work. They're more than equipped to do the work that is required by the institution. But we want to give them an opportunity where in other scenarios, they would not have the opportunity. So that's just my 2 cents on that. I can go on for a while and get on that soapbox. But more than anything, it signifies that African Americans, we got to be more involved at the state and federal and local level politically as Christians than we have ever before. Last question. I thought this was a great question. What are your thoughts about the church and transparency? And my thought here is, again, it goes back to accountability. Yes, we ought to be transparent financially, transparent morally, transparent in terms of our strategies and what the purposes that we want to do. I think that's fair. People ought to be able to trust the institutions that they support. And I think that's a fair thing. My issue is when transparency, sincere transparency, is hijacked for some cancel culture purpose, or somebody's trying to build their social media following. And that's where I part ways. And so, yes, I think institutions have a responsibility to be more transparent. I put this in the same category with leaders. Leaders do bear a greater accountability, but with that, let's be fair with institutions. Let's be fair with leaders. Leaders are people. People make mistakes, some intentionally, but a lot unintentionally. And it just seems to be in our culture, which used to be a church principle, there's less room for grace even amongst the secular thinkers than even amongst religious thinkers. And that should not be the case. If we expect God to extend us grace on our mistakes, why are we so hard on those that may confess, that may admit, I didn't handle this right, and somehow we want to banish them forever? And so those are my thoughts on institutions and churches in terms of transparency. I think as Christians, there's a level of transparency we need to bring back to our faith expression. And what I mean by that is that before we try to tell people what they should do, we must first, number one, learn to listen. Because many times we don't know their narrative, we don't know their story, we don't know their experience, and we don't even know what God is doing in their lives. And the only way you can do that is first listen and try to process and discern and be the support of what the Spirit of God is already doing. The Spirit is already there. As Christians, we want to get ahead of the Spirit, and we wonder why those opportunities are sabotaged. It's because we're getting ahead of the Spirit. But then number two, I think sometimes we have to start with ourselves if there's an interest. Instead of starting with criticism on others, start with ourselves. Start with the fact that Christianity is a faith process. Start with the fact that we don't always have it right. Start with the fact that we have made mistakes and God is gracious and God is forgiving. Start with the fact that even if we've been in the faith, as I have been for 30, 40 plus years, I still don't get it right. I'm still learning and trying to help people on this same path. And I don't bring a billy club. No, I bring a towel. I bring hands of grace to support and encourage people to experience what I have been so privileged to experience in my walk with God. And so that ought to be our position as it comes to transparency. A lot of great questions, a lot of great thoughts. If you can make the rewind, guys, you want to make this. These open mic sessions are tremendous. We're even talking about maybe after our next series, we'll do a special series just on politics and Christianity and where we should stand, particularly with 2024 around the corner. it's going to be major. And we surely want to give place for understanding what the word teaches, as well as place for expression on that. God bless you guys. Love to hear from you if you have questions, and definitely be looking for you in the next video. Take care.